Andy and Wes here from Apologetics Canada. We're in Egypt working on a new project called Can I Trust the Bible?
Well, you might be asking the question, well, why are Andy and I here in Egypt to talk about the complexities and issues regarding the Bible? Well, the reality of it is the vast majority of those handwritten copies, what we call the manuscripts of the Bible, and particularly the earliest ones, come from Egypt.
And with your doctoral work in the area of theology and manuscripts, what got you interested in the Bible?
I realized that I was engaging with a lot of people, skeptics of all different stripes, and all of them would resort to some sort of, well, that sounds great, Wes, but all you're relying on is the Bible. That's your foundation. And you can't trust that. All you have are translations of translations of translations. All you have are error-ridden copies. You don't even know if you have the right books. You're reading Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but have you ever heard of the Gospel of Thomas? And so I realized that if that was true, I'm staking my entire life on the person of Jesus. And where do I find the information about Jesus? I find that in the Bible. And if I can't trust the Bible, I really have no reason to put my hope and trust in Jesus. The content is encompassing ideas that really weren't floating around in Greco-Roman antiquity until at earliest the 2nd century. And so because they have particular flavors to them, and they often portray, or not often, almost exclusively, they portray Jesus as a pagan philosopher or mystic. And if we're looking at contents and we're looking at, okay, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John portray Jesus as a Jewish rabbi. Well, Jesus was living in Roman-occupied Judea and Galilee. He was in a very Hebraic culture. He was an ethnic Jew. And so would it make more sense of Jesus to be a pagan philosopher who then was written in as a Jewish rabbi? Or would it make more sense of him to have been a Jewish rabbi who is not very palatable to the pagan audience? And so these later groups then appropriate Jesus and make him into a pagan mystic. I think that's much more plausible and likely.
Okay, everyone. Welcome again to the Kirkwood Center podcast for Theology and Ethics. My name is Anthony Costello. I am joined today by our Vice President, Lenny Esposito.
Good morning.
And all the way from the Great White North, our good friend and colleague, Wesley Huff, meaning from Canada. That's what the Great White North is. So, Wes, thanks for joining us today. How are you doing up there?
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. It was actually white recently. The first day of spring, it snowed something awful here in Toronto. But the sun is out. It melted the snow. We're back to what should be normal weather. So praying against any more of that, because that's just ridiculous. Even for Canada, that's ridiculous. But I'm doing wonderful.
Yeah.
I mean,
what was the Canadian comedy? Was it Second City TV? And the two guys, who were the two?
Bob and Doug McKenzie.
Yes, the McKenzie.
Dave Thomas and Rick Moranis.
Yeah. Remember that?
Yeah.
That's what I think of when I think of Canada.
It was them and Red Green. Did you ever watch Red Green?
Yeah, the Red Green show, right?
Fix everything with duct tape. Yeah.
That's comedy. That's comedy. But we're not going to do comedy today as much as Wes might want to introduce some Canadian stand up here. We are going to be dealing with a perennial issue in apologetics, and one that sort of has flared up a little bit on the sort of apologetics, counter apologetics scene online, which is who wrote the Gospels. So this is a New Testament issue. We brought Wes on because he's right smack dab in the middle of his New Testament studies dissertation. Wes, where are you doing your dissertation, by the way?
So I'm doing it at the University of Toronto. So I'm part of Wycliffe College, which is part of the Toronto School of Theology, which is part of the University of Toronto more broadly. So that's where my PhD is from.
right in the middle of PhD and dissertation writing. So taking some time out here to help us with this question of who wrote the Gospels, or the authorship of and we'll get into the dating, of course, a little bit as well. But as I said, there's been some back and forth online between some Christian YouTubers like Michael Jones over at Aspiring Philosophy, and counter apologists, I guess that may be the right name for them, like Paulogia, on this question of who authored the Gospels. Do we have actual reliable attributions for gospel authorship? So, Wes, let's jump right into it. There's been a lot of discussion here. The debate is going back and forth. Haven't been able to track it all, but it is a perennial question in apologetics, right? So maybe let's just start us off with 30,000 foot overview of the question of authorship of the Gospels. And why is that important? Why is that important to us as Christians to know who wrote the Gospel? Or maybe it isn't. So what do you think?
Yeah. So this is a question that's been floating around. It's really more of a modern question. Up until about 200 years ago, everybody stuck with the authors that are at the top of your Gospels, the Gospel according to, and then that name that followed, them being the authors. And there wasn't really any reason to question that for a long, long time. And then about 200, 150 years ago, with German rationalism and a few other things that were being questioned about biblical authority and reliability in general, one of the questions that popped up was, well, do we really know who these authors are? And that's where it wasn't invented there, but that's where the arguments for anonymity really started to become popular. That the Gospels are associated with these individuals, but it's really a big question mark as to who the original authors were. And there was this idea, which I think actually has credence, of formal anonymity, that if you took off the titles, the Gospel according to blank, you wouldn't know who the author was. And there's actual, reason to argue that, in the sense that if you remove the Gospel heading and then you just read the text, could you figure out who the author was? Well, you really couldn't necessarily, or you wouldn't come up with the names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John necessarily. But that seems to be a separate question from the fact that we have a lot of conversation within the early church and within the manuscript tradition more broadly as to who the authors are. And I think that goes a long way into giving the historical evidence the benefit of the doubt and saying, why some of these questions are interesting to discuss, but really at the end of the day, saying we have no idea who wrote these documents, I think really is a bit of a misnomer.
So yeah, there's very much a innocent until proven guilty approach that many historians take, both archaeologically and paleographically. That you should assume the understanding is what it is at face value, unless there's something that would be seen as amiss. Right? If you have a long tradition and you have external sources who are testifying to this, then you really got to build up a pretty tough case to say, this is why that's not true.
Yeah, it's called the principle of credulity in epistemology, right? And you believe a testimony until you have controverting evidence to undermine the testimony. So yeah, Wes, so historically, we would say, like, with the rise of higher biblical criticism, especially in Germany, where all bad things come from, with the exception of bratwurst. But with the rise of higher biblical criticism in Germany, there's a skeptical move. There's a questioning of all of the received tradition, right? So, and I was reading not too long ago where someone had placed really the emergence of biblical criticism with Spinoza in the 17th, 18th century, because he was the first one to sort of formally in writing question Mosaic authorship of the Torah. Okay, so 200 years roughly of sort of questioning the received wisdom. What are well, let me ask this. Let's say we didn't have the names attributed to the Gospels. What difference might that make?
Well, I'll back up a little bit and I'll say I will address that question specifically.
Okay.
But I think one of the things this conversation misses is when we look at biographical material within the Greco-Roman world, are the Gospels unusual in that they're formally anonymous? And I think of between the 90 and 100 biographical type writings we have on either side of Jesus. So if we go 100 years, 150 years before Jesus and 150 years after Jesus, so we have about a 300-year period of ancient antiquity, there are between 90 and 100 kind of biographical writing materials that we have. Only 2 of those identify themselves formally within the writings. The rest are all what we would call formally anonymous. It's only Historia Augusta, the life of Aelius, and Lucian's Passing of Peregrinus that actually identify themselves within the text. And Plutarch, who's considered one of the most important ancient biographers within ancient antiquity, he wrote 60 biographies, 40 of which survive today. Plutarch is never mentioned within any of his extant writings. He never identifies himself once.
Like he never says, I, Plutarch, have written. Yeah. So
no, he never. Yeah. So there's no formal kind of autobiographical designation. And actually we have Xenophon and Caesar are not just formally anonymous, but they refer to themselves in the third person, which I think is not dissimilar to what we see in the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of John. So even with this accusation of formal anonymity, which I would say, yes, they are formally anonymous.
Formally anonymous.
We can,
okay.
Yeah. And so we can say, well, is this unusual? Well, no, it's not. And yet, even though we have 40 extant writings of Plutarch, nobody dares to question that Plutarch wrote them because we have this long tradition in history that these writings are associated directly with Plutarch. And so I think this is where we fall into an area. Richard Balcombe in the UK, the historian, kind of points this out, where he says that New Testament scholars tend to be far more critical than classicists. Classicists and historians actually give a lot more of the benefit of the doubt to ancient writings, whereas New Testament authors, or New Testament scholars rather, because they have this kind of history coming out of higher criticism of being so skeptical, they often jump to conclusions where when you jump over to the classicists, they're going, well, I don't have any reason to think that Plutarch didn't write that. Everybody says he did. So when we come to Matthew and everybody's saying Matthew wrote Matthew, you say, well, why are we questioning that? I think that's important. So, but to go back to the original question, to go back to your original question, I do think that authorial status and position does matter in one sense, in that the early Christian community, especially when we're talking about the canon of Scripture, what books are considered and recognized as inspired, for the New Testament, the main criteria that the early church used to discern that was, is it connected to someone who knew Jesus or someone who knew Jesus? And so in that sense, its status as being connected directly with the apostolic community is very important. But we still have writings like the book of Hebrews where it's anonymous in the sense that we have no formal designation consistently, and you don't know who's writing it. And yet the early church still connects it to the early apostolic community despite that.
Right. That's right. I mean, it is. Yeah. So it does matter in the sense of, for the early church, especially with regard to canonicity, that something was written by an eyewitness or someone who knew an eyewitness. Right.
Yeah. And I think those are important points as well. A couple of things are interesting when you look at the compilation of the canon, how the canon came to be. First of all, apostolic authority is key, especially in an ancient culture. And this is another thing, Wes, I'm sure you're familiar with, is they valued eyewitness testimony, verbal testimony above written testimony. They actually, if you could go and hear the eyewitnesses, that was the best you can get. And that's why Paul says, even in 1 Corinthians 15, hey, go out and ask these guys. Don't just take my letter at face value. Go out and ask them. And I think it's Bauckham that points out what happens is about 60 AD, the apostles are getting older and they're starting to die off. And somebody is going to say, hey, we better put their words down on paper before they aren't around to tell us directly anymore. And so you get a couple of things that follow from that. First of all, because apostolic authority becomes important, all of the Gnostic texts, all of the fraudulent stuff that show up in the second century, try to attach themselves to an apostle, right? The Gospel of Thomas,
that's right.
The Gospel of Peter. You have all of these things. Why is the Gospel of Judas the Gospel of Judas? Because he was at least one of the 12. So there's a tradition saying that if you're going to have any credence at all within the early church, you better attach yourself to an apostolic figure. That's interesting to show that the original documents that had credence were attached to an apostolic figure. But the second piece that's fascinating is, if I was making this up from scratch, I would never pick these guys. Mark and Luke.
Well, Mark and Luke, right, would be unusual.
Those are big. And Matthew was a kind of a secondary character in all the gospel accounts. He's not the primary mover. He's not, one of the big three. John. Yeah,
you'd pick Peter, James, John, and maybe Andrew.
Maybe Andrew, somebody like that. But I think that testifies to their credibility on top of the other issues.
Yeah,
Wes,
definitely. I think that's a good point. Yeah, I think that's a really good point to highlight, in the fact that the earliest tradition of who Mark was that he was a companion of Peter, and he got his information from Peter. So at that point, you would almost assume that they would call it the Gospel of Peter, and they don't. They call it the Gospel of Mark. Why? Because Mark is the author. And so if they were wanting to really capitalize on this apostolic authority, they could have called it the Gospel of Peter, which, by the way, the apocryphal Gospel of Peter really goes to lengths to try to say, hey, I'm Peter. It says it at the beginning and it says it at the end. It's really trying to capitalize on this fact and in the text. And I think that's a really good point, Lenny, because the Gospels, the biblical Gospels, the focus is not on who the author is, it's who the subject of the material is. This is truly the gospel, the good news, and that's about Jesus. And so it happens to be according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Whereas if you read the apocryphal Gospels, a lot of them are really trying to capitalize not necessarily on the focus of the material on Jesus, but on the author to try to appropriate a level of authority that they don't actually have.
And maybe get book sales.
Maybe, although you know what? Right? These were not very popular. Yeah, huh? I don't think they were actually. We only have the Gospel of Thomas is definitely the most successful, in the sense that we have 3 copies from Oxyrhynchus, Egypt, which come from the 2nd century. They're in Greek, and they're fragmentary. And then our final copy, which I was out in Egypt this last summer in June, and I got to go to the Coptic Museum in Cairo, rather, and see the actual codex of the Gospel of Thomas, and sit there and read the first couple of pages. And it's in Coptic. It's entirely preserved, but that's it. 3 fragments in Greek and 1 complete manuscript in Coptic, and that's by far and away the most popular of all of these. All the others,
apocryphal texts,
in the sense of surviving manuscripts that we have extant today. All the others are just singles. So the Gospel of Peter, we only have 1. The Gospel of Mary, we only have 1. The Gospel of Judas, we only have 1. And so, whereas between the 2nd and 4th centuries, really 2nd and 3rd centuries, we have close to a dozen copies of John, close to a dozen copies of Matthew. And then we have to be careful with that argument, because Luke is not nearly as numerous and Mark is even less. But based on that, we know that at least these Gospels were being spread around, whereas the Gnostic Gospels were only really being used in very small pockets across the ancient world, and almost exclusively in Egypt.
Given the textual evidence that we have, the manuscript evidence that we have, we can make an argument that it's likely that the canonical gospels were being more reproduced and disseminated more than the later Gnostic or apocryphal texts, gospels.
Yeah. So I wouldn't say that this is a bulletproof argument. The number of manuscripts don't mean in total that a definitive way that these books were in or out in terms of canonicity. And there are books that were viewed as canonical that have very few manuscripts, like Mark, like Revelation. However, we have between the 2nd and 4th centuries, we have 17 total manuscripts of all the apocryphal material. So that's like the whole breadth of Thomas, Peter, James, Mary, Judas, go down the rabbit hole of all the names you could possibly think of. 17 manuscripts. Whereas between the 2nd and 3rd centuries, for just for the New Testament, so it's a bigger pool, it's 27 books, but we have 60 manuscripts in whole or in part of those, 12 coming from Matthew and 18 coming from John. So it's definitely being copied and disseminated more.
Okay. I mean, I'm looking at a quote here. I've been reading in Clement of Alexandria for the last few years. He wrote a lot. And I was just reading this morning. He says he's talking about the scriptures in Stromata, book 7, chapter 15, 16, 17. And I'll just quote here. He says, this is Clement of Alexandria. So writing in around 200, Stromatas, they would be someplace, end of the 2nd, early 3rd century. And he says, for that the human assemblies, he's talking about the heretics here. He calls them the human assemblies. For that the human assemblies which they held were posterior to the Catholic Church, requires not many words to show for the teaching of our Lord at his advent, beginning with Augustus and Tiberius, was completed in the middle of the times of Tiberius. So that's the Gospels. And that of the apostles embracing the ministry of Paul ends with Nero. So he's kind of placing Paul in the epistles ending in or around the time of Nero. And then he says it was later in the times of Hadrian the king that those who invented the heresies arose. And they extended to the age of Antonius the Elder, as for instance, Basilides, though he claims for his master Glaucius, the interpreter of Peter. End quote. So Hadrian's around 120, 125, I think 130 AD as emperor. And it seems to me that, and the previous chapters of Stromata Book 7 here are all about the scriptures. So for Clement writing in 200, the Gospels and Paul, the epistles, are kind of all there roughly by the mid-60s. And then these other teachings, Thomas and whatever, are arising in sort of the early mid-second century, which I think roughly bears out, right? Scholarship-wise?
Yeah, and that's we can look at the content of a lot of these documents as well. The content is encompassing ideas that really weren't floating around in Greco-Roman antiquity until at earliest the 2nd century. And so because they have particular flavors to them, and they often portray, or not often, almost exclusively, they portray Jesus as a pagan philosopher or mystic. And if we're looking at contents and we're looking at, okay, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John portray Jesus as a Jewish rabbi. Well, Jesus was living in Roman occupied Judea and Galilee. He was in a very Hebraic culture. He was an ethnic Jew. And so would it make more sense of Jesus to be a pagan philosopher who then was written in as a Jewish rabbi? Or would it make more sense of him to have been a Jewish rabbi who is not very palatable to the pagan audience? And so these later groups then appropriate Jesus and make him into a pagan mystic. I think that's much more plausible and likely.
Right.
Well, one other point, though, the interesting thing with the pseudepigraphal writings, especially the Gnostic Gospels, is they also tacitly testify to the existence of the 4 primary gospels, because where they spend their time is where the 4 gospels do not. So you have the infancy narrative of Thomas, for example, where they try to say, what happened to Jesus between the Bethlehem and his, presentation in the temple at 12? What happened in all those years? Oh, he was making clay birds and turning them into pigeons to fly away. Or the Apocryphon of Peter, where it's like, how did Jesus actually get out of the tomb? What happened during his actual resurrection process, right? Or the Gospel of Judas, where Jesus pulls Judas aside privately, and basically the first 3 or 4 chapters are just dealing with Jesus talking to Judas and saying, here's how it's going to play out, and here's what you have to do. All of the testimony of these Gnostic Gospels are trying to fill holes where the 4 canonical Gospels haven't spoken. And isn't that an interesting testimony to the fact that the canonical Gospels, A, must have already existed, and B, had such stature that people said, well, there's a missing part to the story and everybody's asking about it. Maybe I can
add it in.
That thought.
Well, and that there's an analogy there in the Old Testament when you get to the deuterocanonical. The Old Testament apocryphal and pseudo-epigraphical works. They're also like the testimony of Moses, or I don't know all the names, but they're also just trying to add more details into the older Hebrew Bible texts, right? The books of the Hebrew Bible, because people are asking questions, and these are obviously written in the Hellenistic period, and they're trying to do the same thing. They're trying to add more details to these ancient traditions, these ancient texts, because these are popular questions that people are asking. So it seems to be a hallmark of later authorship when you have these more extravagant or elaborate sort of details and stories, right?
Or your Joseph Smith.
Yeah, for sure. Of modern examples. But I think even they go beyond that in the sense that they're not just trying to fill out where the gaps are. We have evidence of some of them actually trying to correct it. Where, Lenny, you mentioned the Apocryphon of Peter, when it has that camera rolling on the resurrection. I think what we have there is an example of the early witnesses to this, or the early individuals looking at this information, looking at who the witnesses were to the resurrection, primarily being the women who came to the tomb, first and foremost, being embarrassed by the fact that the testimony was women. And so the Gospel of Peter tries to correct that by having all the right people there at the right time. So they have the Roman and Jewish officials camping out in front of the tomb, and then being privy to that event happening. And so what that does is it corrects what they see as a problematic amount of details about who the first witnesses were, and then puts the right people at the right places who they deem as reliable early witness testimony. So, and obviously that's a count against them, because the Jewish officials on Passover would not be camping out in front of a dead body. So whoever's writing this has a complete ignorance of Jewish purity rituals and what the high priest would be doing anyways. And then in their effort to try to correct this type of information, they actually end up showing just a profound ignorance of the historical and religious sociocultural practices of the day.
That's good. So Wes, so as to the 4 canonical gospels, where is, I mean, I always hate this question, where is the scholarship on X, Y, or Z, as if there's ever any real consensus, but there might be. I don't know. I'm not a New Testament guy. Is there a general working consensus for the dates of the gospels these days? I mean, I know still some people will play some late, 90s, 100s, others try and get them earlier, 50s, 60s, but where would you fall on that, on just the dating of the texts?
Yeah, I don't know if I've seen a recent synopsis of the scholarly position. I don't know who's conducting those types of polls anyways,
some kind
because
of
I see all
studies of
sorts
the
of polls on
studies or
New
something.
Testament scholarship, and no one's polling me. So I don't know
Well, they
who's in that
better,
group.
especially.
I know, right? But I think generally, if you kind of read the breadth of the scholarship, the dates are relatively late. They're usually anywhere between, especially in secular scholarship, you'll see people maybe putting Mark as early as 60, and then all the others kind of falling in somewhere in between 70 and 80, and then John at 90.
And Mark is still generally always put earliest, right?
I think that,
The
yeah,
Mark in priority.
that's more or less the general consensus. I am seeing more and more people questioning that, and I think not for wrong reasons. I mean, even my doctoral supervisor is an expert in the synoptic problem, which is the field of trying to figure out, which of the Gospels were written first, especially because Matthew, Mark, and Luke have this literary connection to one another. And even he will say, as the person who literally publishes the critical edition of Q, he will say it's a best estimate. It's we don't know for sure. None of these things come with dates. There are ancient documents that come with dates. The Gospels are not part of that group, and so it's an estimation to the best kind of preponderance of evidence. However, I think the majority of scholars would lean in terms of Mark being first. I think I would say I'm in that camp, but I don't hold it with a very tight grip. I think there are good arguments to argue that Matthew could have predated Mark. I think generally I find it more persuasive that Mark was written first. Nonetheless, what I do think is interesting is if you look at, because I'm a manuscript guy, and if you look at the manuscript evidence, like I mentioned before, our latest attested manuscript of the Gospels is Mark. And yet everybody pretty much agrees that it was the earliest one written. So it's despite the fact that we have such late attestation. In the grand scheme of things, it's actually really early attestation. But when you have copies that come from the 2nd century of the other Gospels, then it's really like that's incredibly early. So of the Gospels, our latest attestation is Mark, and yet the general consensus is that was the first written. And actually, our earliest attestation with the manuscripts is of John, which everybody agrees is the latest written.
What's the one on John P? What's the little
57?
52.
57, is that the
52? Yeah, I'm sorry.
I'm sure you have a little.
This guy.
There it is. Yeah. Every text critic has to have one of those.
Yeah, I made this one. I brought some papyrus back from Egypt, and I recreated a bunch of my own facsimiles.
And that's dated at like 120 or something. That's dated in early.
So this is where we have to be careful, because dating is a really
not subjective, but difficult, right?
Whoops.
As much an art as a science.
I'm just knocking things over my bookshelf.
There's
that's okay. Well, I think so. The problem with dating is that there are 3 main ways that we date manuscripts, and all of them more or less converge on 100-year period. And so I think right now, the way that both the fields of paleography, which is the analysis of ancient handwriting, and papyrology, which is the study of ancient papyrus documents, and manuscript studies more broadly, which includes groups like text critics, where the consensus on that is basically just naming the century, or saying something like late 2nd, early 3rd, because if we want to get exact, we run into a lot of issues. So historically, P52 was always dated to the beginning of the 2nd century. That has been brought into question in the last 50 years, and I think that I think that the question has been incorrect. I still think it's approximately that, but the field has become more safe in saying we can at minimum say what century it was found in, and I think that's probably best, because it is really tricky when we start to get to exact numbers.
Right, sure.
Yeah. But yes, so we have early manuscript evidence for John.
Yeah, even though it's generally considered to be the last written, the manuscript evidence is earliest.
And let me say this, because I always think this is interesting for authorship, in that every time we have an ascription, the gospel according to Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, which is either found at the beginning of the manuscript or the end of the manuscript, if we have that section preserved for us, whenever we have the text of Matthew, we always have the ascription of Matthew. Whenever we have the text of Mark, we always have the ascription of Mark. There's never any confusion. There's never any, we have the text of John, but we have some other author named. And that's where I think, a major problem with the theory of complete gospel anonymity is the utter implausibility that the book was circulating around the Roman Empire as prolifically as the Gospels did, without a title for almost 100 years, and could somehow at some point be attributed to exactly the same author by scribes in completely different geographical areas, and yet leave no trace of disagreements in any of the manuscripts. And by the way, this is supposed to have happened not just for one, but for all four Gospels. So I think that fact alone, for me as a manuscript guy, if I'm consistently, no matter what time frame, no matter what geographical location, if I'm finding copies of the Gospels in Egypt, or I'm finding them in Syria, or I'm finding them in the British Isles, and everybody is saying, hey, here's the text of John, and it's the Gospel according to John, nobody's ascribing a different author. Nobody's ascribing a different individual connected to the early Jesus community. There's complete consistency. I mean, I feel like that's hard to argue against.
That's a good point.
Okay. So let me try and enumerate some of the arguments here for traditional authorship that we've mentioned. One, we talked about a sort of hyper skepticism with regards to biblical studies that isn't quite the same in just classical studies. And we don't need to get into possible motivations for that, although I think we can all kind of guess what some motivations might be for that kind of skepticism. And that sort of emerges with higher biblical criticism in the 18th and 19th century, especially in Germany, that is, really questioning in a sort of rationalistic framework, probably the received wisdom of the church. We talked about the later apocryphal gospels and how they're presupposing, of course, the gospel narratives that we have in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and even trying to sort of correct them because they think they've made mistakes that don't line up with later, probably Greek philosophy and things like that. We talked about why would the church ascribe it to these four guys, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as opposed to sort of better candidates. If you wanted to get sort of have more authority from your author, why not Peter, James, John, and maybe sort of like Andrew or something, some more prominent figures. And then, Wes, you just mentioned the text critical issue of agreement about who wrote the Gospels across independent regions, right? Where when you have the texts in different areas, people in those areas are ascribing them to the same authors, the same four authors, and not to like Bob or somebody.
Or even just mixing up the known authors, like having the text of Matthew but ascribing it to Mark. Even that
right.
We don't find.
Not right. Okay. Right. Not having Mark and say, oh, that and confusing it with Matthew, the authorship with Matthew, but it's always, it's uniform. There's a uniformity to the ascription of authorship.
Yeah. Without exception.
Okay.
Can we talk a little bit about Papias and his testimony? Because I think that may be relevant.
Let's focus in on Mark then a little bit. Right. I mean, that's usually associated with Mark, right? Papias is okay.
Well, he supposedly mentions, Eusebius talked about Papias mentioning all four of the Gospels and attributing them.
Yeah. Okay. I don't know, Wes, do you want to address that a little bit?
Yeah, I think there's early unanimity in that regard. I mean, this is not just Papias, but you also have Irenaeus when he writes against heresies. He said it's not even possible that the Gospels could be either more or fewer in number than they are. And then he makes an argument from numerology because of the four cherubim and the four winds, or four-faced cherubim, and that's in Against Heresies, book 3. And he is, unanimous that it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then he has a contemporary, Theophilus of Antioch, who writes a letter called to Autocles. And in 3:12, he says that the same voice of the Spirit that spoke through the prophets speaks through the Gospels. And then he mentions Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so it's you have this, unanimity of early church witnesses with Papias, with Irenaeus, with Theophilus. And like you said before, Tony, that there's no debate about the Gospels and about Paul's letters really early on. And so you have this strong kind of body of witnesses within the early church fathers. So zeroing down on Papias is a good one because he is connected directly to the apostolic community.
He supposedly he was could go all the way back to the 80s, right? Speaking to disciples who were disciples of the apostles.
Yeah.
So, and Wes, I don't know if you're tracking the counter. If you know, like what then are some of the arguments that skeptics might make? And as far as I know, there's only one New Testament scholar who appears on YouTube, Bart Ehrman. I don't know if they're well, you may hear the second.
He's definitely
it is true. Like the guy's like on every podcast. I think he's the only New Testament scholar that exists. But no, what are some of the arguments then that maybe would be raised against traditional authorship?
Well, if we're going down the Papias route, the typical argument would be that the only evidence we have of Papias is from Eusebius, who is in the 4th century. So there's a removal of kind of the origination of the eyewitness testimony. You would also there's also doubt cast on some of the early Jesus community in general, in that their connections with the apostles, they would say, are far looser than we would like to connect them with, even though they're making these types of arguments. I don't find that convincing. And I think, once again, we can give them the benefit of the doubt that when we have individuals like Clement of Rome, of Irenaeus, of Papias, of, Polycarp, these individuals who are quoting scripture, who are referencing scripture, who testify to their direct connection with the closest Jesus community, that we can say, well, what reason do they have to lie about that? Because they're not gaining social status, they're not getting fame, they're not getting, women, money, the typical things that we would do, motivate us to lie. They're not getting any of that. In fact, most of the time they're getting the complete opposite. So I would say that there's a motivation issue there. Because there are literary theories that surround the origination of the content within the Gospels, particularly the attributions of Jesus saying particular things. People would cast doubt on that. The miraculous events that are recorded about him. His prediction of the destruction of the temple is a big reason why a lot of secular scholars date the Gospels late, because if Jesus predicts the destruction of the temple and then that happens in 70 AD, well, then that obviously has to be written afterwards, and it's written onto the mouth of Jesus.
Right.
So that it looks like he did actually predict the destruction of the temple.
Right. Vaticanus ex eventu, I think, is the technical. Right. The reading back. Okay. Yeah. That would certainly. Yeah, I could see that. I mean, that's common, right, to want to date things later, because the idea that there could be a future telling prophecy that comes true is sort of excluded from the outset in your historical studies, right?
Yeah, and then there are some other scholars who ascribe that Luke is drawing from Josephus in particular areas, and Josephus is writing later, and so some have pushed Luke out even to the early 2nd century because of that. Once again, I think that that's not very strong in terms of its actual evidence in terms of the truth claims. I don't see a reason why. In fact, I think there are bigger differences between the supposed connections between Josephus and Luke than I think there are between the connectivity of, say, Paul and Luke. When Paul is writing to Timothy and he quotes Luke, I think that there's a stronger connection in terms of the word for word verbatim quotations that Paul uses compared to the connections between the supposed connections between Luke and Josephus. So it's not that there are no reasons. It's not that scholars are coming up with these ideas completely off the top of their heads. They have justification for what they're doing. I just think the justification is usually not as strong as the evidence on the other side, or that they're coming in with preconceived ideas and notions. So if you assume natural materialism, that obviously Jesus can't predict something that's going to happen in the future, well, then it's not completely off the cuff to then say, well, then this has to be written back onto Jesus. I just don't assume natural materialism. And so therefore, I think that Jesus could have predicted the destruction of the temple.
Well, and you just have a more modern standard for evidence and the making of conclusions, where you expect, before you make any firm conclusion about something, you want, a greater level or degree of evidence, which you're just not going to necessarily get that in the ancient world. So that you're just going to remain agnostic about things. So I could see that being the case for some as well. Okay. Anything else on this? I think we wanted to do a little bit extra on the Gospel of John specifically. Maybe look at that a little bit more closely, because that is obviously different from the synoptics certainly in content.
And who is John?
And then maybe let's talk about that. So, Wes, if you have a few extra minutes, maybe we'll do something a little bit on the Gospel of John. I don't know if you just want to kick that off for us. How is John different? I mean, we talked a little bit about the manuscript evidence, but when it comes to authorship, is there maybe even, I don't know, is there another level of sort of anonymity there with John? Because conservative scholars will debate over who this John is, right?
Yeah, I think we have the fact that there's a lot of consensus that an individual named Johannes, John, wrote the Gospel of John. But the question is that the disciple John? The early church writings ascribe an individual named John the Elder. Is that the same person? And then you have the disciple whom Jesus loved, continually mentioned throughout the Gospels. And so that's clearly the source information of the main eyewitness of where this material is coming from is this particular disciple. So who is this disciple? So there are a number of options. I think part of the argumentation against it being the fisherman John is that there's certain levels of information within internally the gospel that kind of show that the conversations that the author seems to have access to requires a level of social status that a fisherman would not have been able to get into those rooms. And so you could get around that by saying,
conversations that occur during the Passion Week, especially, or during the trial of Jesus, during the trial specifically,
particularly
knowing that Pilate's wife had a dream, for example. That's insider information. That's not going to be, Pilate's not going to come out and tell that to the general public. That has to happen within Pilate's household. And so there's a speculation that someone was connected with Pilate's household in well-to-do circles, that type of thing.
Yeah, or the Sanhedrin, these areas where there would have been a certain level of socioeconomic and religious status that would have been required to have access to these conversations. Now, you could get around that by saying that, well, John is likewise interviewing eyewitnesses, and that's how he's getting information. Right. That the source information doesn't have to necessarily be of one, particular line of evidence. And I think that that's valid. I think this is also where there was a theory that was developed, and then I think it was, when I first heard about it, was under Craig Evans, where the individual, the disciple whom Jesus loved, was being proposed as Lazarus, because the first time someone was described as being loved by Jesus in that way was when Jesus was going to raise Lazarus from the dead, and they came to him and said, the one whom you love has died. And so after that point, that's when this character, the disciple whom Jesus loved, starts to pop up all over the place after John chapter 11. And so then the theory predicated on that is that this is actually Lazarus. And so Lazarus would have been of a particular social standing that we can see from at least the status of Mary and Martha, being able to host, being able to financially provide, and those types of things, that they very well could have had this kind of social standing that would have allowed him to get into these rooms. Now, these are all theories. And so at the end of the day, we can come down on one decision or another, but we're never going to actually know. But nonetheless, whoever is writing the Gospel of John, his name is almost certainly John because of the evidence that we have based on that. And because the early church really doesn't ascribe it to anybody else.
Again, right. Yeah. No, there's no other ascription.
Yeah. Which is
you do have to at least say that the individual who wrote first of all, there's internally, I think there's some testimony. It's interesting that Peter mentions, the transfiguration in his letter. It was something so big that it moved him. And in 1 John, we were eyewitnesses of his glory, right? The same kind of testimony. Yeah. And if you look at the transfiguration, there's only a few people there. Plus you have the Last Supper, and the one whom Jesus loved leaned his head on his breast. So you got a Last Supper participant as well. So internally, there's some continuity for the traditional understanding of John as the author. Now, obviously, Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea were followers who had access to the Sanhedrin. So those Sanhedrin pieces, I don't have any, because Nicodemus came at night and interviewed Jesus. We have John chapter 3, the whole thing. So whoever is writing the Gospel of John has direct access to Nicodemus, and at least that story. We've got that portion covered. And then there's some evidence that one of the maidservants in Pilate's household was a later convert to Christianity. So there are, it's not just throw a wild speculation at a dartboard kind of thing. There are other issues that come into play here.
Yeah, and I think the Achilles heel of a lot of these proposed individuals that have scholars have hypothesized in the last few decades is the fact that we don't have any attribution of any of those other individuals being the authors within the early church period. And so if it was Lazarus, why did nobody even think of mentioning that?
Yeah, Lazarus, I mean, that would certainly, I'd have to go back and look at Baucham's Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, and it's not a huge part of the book, but it is in there where he posits yet another John. Yeah. I think it's the John that appears in Acts chapter 4, but that is not John of the 12 apostles. It's a John who seems to be attached to the high priest somehow, or within the inner circle of the high priest, the high priestly office. Yeah. And he's just mentioned there in like Acts 4. And I think Baucham tries to stretch a little bit and say maybe it's this other John who would have access to, as you say, like the Sanhedrin and stuff, and that's where he would have known about more intimate details of Jesus's trial. And that's a nice theory. It does, I lean that way just because the content of John is so different. that it's like, wow, was there somebody who had just different kind of access to different data that would explain a lot. But I think there's not a lot of counter evidence to the traditional idea that it's just John the Apostle, right?
Yeah, and I would argue personally for traditional authorship, and I would say that's a main reason why it does sound so different. So I would say, based on the early church evidence, we know that John was the last living apostle. And actually, a late date for John comes from the early church, in that it says that he wrote close to his death, and that he was one of, if not the last apostle living. And so while late dating for the other gospels is actually, in spite of the early church testimony, late dating for John is actually because of the early church testimony. And I would say that's true. He's probably writing in the mid to late 90s. And one of the reasons why the Gospel of John sounds so different is because he is at least aware of the content of the other Gospels that are floating around. Whether he knows the written source intimately is a different question. He may or may not have. But I think he's aware of the stories that are floating around. And so he knows he's probably the last living apostle. He knows that the apostolic witness is dying out and will die out with him. And so he proposes to write another gospel. He proposes to write another gospel that explains the rest of the story. And he's not going to repeat what everybody already knows. So he comes along and he says, hey, let me tell you the rest of the story as someone who was an eyewitness. Let me fill in some of the gaps here. And the reason why it sounds so different is because he's not interested in repeating what everyone else is already very well acquainted with. And so he fills out, and he has a purpose, right? All of the gospel authors have a purpose in what they're writing. And so when John comes around, he's focusing on Jesus's claim to be Yahweh, the God of Israel, who has become human. And as God, he can do for us what we could never do for ourselves. Whereas the other gospels have different intentions in mind. Not that they're not focusing on Jesus being Yahweh, they certainly are. But John is coming in later, and he's really trying to hit that home for a particular reason. And he's not going to beat around the bush and repeat all the same stories that everybody else knows. And so personally, that's why I think it sounds so different.
Yeah, he's writing to the church, and the other three gospels are almost an outreach to the world in an evangelistic sense. But John is writing to those who kind of initially established themselves as believers, and now he's trying to give you more substance to carry your faith. And Gnosticism is just starting its seeds at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that the earlier gospels are really highlighting more of the Jewish fulfillment of Jesus. You know, Matthew presents Jesus as the fulfillment of Jewish expectations, particularly in fulfilling the Davidic reign, as well as Jesus being the new Moses, right? Jesus and Moses both come from Egypt when they're children. Moses crosses the Red Sea. Jesus is baptized in the Jordan River. Moses is in the wilderness for 40 years, and Jesus is in the wilderness for 40 days. Moses receives the law on a mountain. Jesus gives the law from the mountain. And so this is very impactful to the early Jewish community. And that's why it sounds like that. His motivation is he's trying to hit a home run. And so John, like you said, Lenny, I think you're correct. He has a broader audience in people who are already, interested in the church community. There's a church community being established. And so he's going to capitalize on that audience in a different way than the previous gospel authors are.
You know what? Since you mentioned Matthew there, let me ask this last question then, and then we can kind of wrap up. So I've been reading through James Edwards's Pillar New Testament commentary on Luke, and he mentions a source that he calls the Hebrew gospel, or the gospel that is written in Hebrew, which is also, he says, referenced by at least a dozen early church fathers. Now, one source theory is that Matthew, the same author of the Greek Gospel of Matthew, also wrote, before he wrote the Greek version, wrote a version in Hebrew, and then wrote his gospel in the Greek. Now, I don't think that Edwards is making a determination about who wrote this Hebrew gospel. Maybe it's Matthew, maybe it was somebody else. But I mean, but what his reason for arguing that there was a Hebrew gospel is that there's all these Hebraisms or Semiticisms in the Gospel of Luke, in Luke Acts, actually. So I don't know if you've heard much about that, but I mean, would you have anything to add to that or say about that theory, that source theory?
Yeah, I would say he's probably being liberal on saying that there are that many early church fathers who refer to Hebraic Matthew. I think
He says it doesn't specifically, but I don't know. He doesn't say which one. He doesn't lay it out which ones, but he does say a dozen. But yeah, okay, go ahead.
Yes. So I think like specifically Papias, who we've mentioned already, it mentions it. And I think anybody else who mentions it is probably drawing on from the testimony of Papias. And even then, Papias says that the collections of the sayings of Jesus were written down, and he has this phrase in the Hebrew dialect, and each interpreted them as well as he could, which is
Right.
the quote from Eusebius ascribed to Papias. And I would actually interpret that as not that Matthew wrote in Hebrew, but that he wrote in a Hebrew way, in the same way that I just highlighted before, is that it's a very Hebrew type gospel. And so this phrase that he wrote in the Hebrew dialect can just as well be translated, he wrote in a very Hebrew style. And I think that is true of Matthew. In fact, I think Matthew is purposefully both writing scripture. I think Matthew thinks he's writing scripture, and B, I think he thinks he's writing Hebrew narrative and that he's finishing the book of Chronicles, whereas Chronicles finishes the Davidic expectation and is the last book of the Jewish Tanakh. I think just as Chronicles starts with the genealogy, Matthew starts with the genealogy and traces Jesus directly to David. And I think that's what he's doing. And then when Papias sees that and says, oh, well, Matthew's writing in a very Hebrew way, I think that fits perfectly, more so than if he's actually writing in Hebrew, because we don't have any evidence for a Hebrew gospel, never mind a Hebrew gospel of Matthew. They're all in Greek. And I see no indication that anything in Matthew is translation Greek. And we can pick out translation Greek.
With regards to Edwards, he's positing a Hebrew gospel because of Luke's gospel, because he says there's this abundance of Semitisms and Hebraisms in Luke, not in Matthew. So that's why I think he's saying he's arguing there was a Hebrew gospel that Luke drew from. Whether or not it was Matthew who wrote it, I think Edwards is staying agnostic. But he's just saying that he does believe there was a Hebrew gospel story prior that Luke drew from. So that would have been at least earlier than Luke. But I don't know. Maybe you haven't.
I mean, it's hypothetical. It's not impossible, but I just don't think it's probable. I don't think it's probable because I think it would be far more likely that it was written in Aramaic than it would be written in Hebrew for the kind of linguistic like notoriety of the time of what languages were actually being spoken and utilized. I think it's very unlikely that it would have been in Hebrew. I think the Hebraicisms are probably a result of the fact that someone like Luke is a Greek and he's writing and he knows that he's going to have both a Greek and a Jewish audience. And so he is making sure that he is translating and he's synthesizing for his audience, who will be a combination of Greeks and Jews, in a way that will make sense both for the Jews and for the Greeks and be both understandable and palatable for both audiences. I think.
Well, and if he's bilingual,
he
could be thinking in both languages as he's writing, I suppose. I don't know.
And I mean, Matthew, I think is written in.
So you would say, just for I just want to get your. You would say you don't think there was a gospel written in Hebrew before that all the gospels, the earliest gospels, the gospels we have were written first right out the bat in Greek.
Unanimously, I think I would say that.
Yeah.
I don't see anything to the contrary. And I think actually, particularly with Matthew, I would say we actually have evidence of verbatim statements from Jesus that Jesus spoke in Greek. And one of the evidences for that is that the Beatitudes in Matthew chapter 5 are alliterations in Greek. And there are particular sections. So blessed are the poor. That's the ptochoi is the first word. Those who mourn is pentontes, and the meek is praise, and then those who hunger is pientontas. And so you have alliteration of the same word in the same way that if you were a good preacher, you would have these kind of linguistic ways of remembering things. And so in English, it's like, oh, blessed are the poor, those who mourn, the meek, those who hunger. But in Greek, there's a style to it that is almost like poetic. And so I think, particularly because Jesus is giving that sermon not far from the Decapolis, which is a unanimously Greek-speaking area, that Jesus knows that there's going to be a lot of Greeks in the audience. He's going to give this in Greek because both of his Greek and Jewish audiences are going to be able to understand him. And he's doing it in a way that is full of linguistic tools that a good preacher today would utilize as well to help his audience remember what he's saying. So I actually think we have verbatim statements of Greek within the Gospel of Matthew that Jesus spoke in Greek.
No, that's a good point, because boy, I feel really ignorant now, because I don't know. I hadn't thought so much about Jesus speaking in Greek that much, because it's always kind of said, well, Jesus would have spoke Aramaic, so he must have done everything in Aramaic. But, what if Jesus was doing a lot of his sermons, especially his very public sermons, in Greek? And so therefore it's not really a translation.
Well, if you want to reach a lot of people.
Yeah. Well, of course, right.
And dialects can really vary culturally as well. So you use the lingua franca, you use the common language.
Koine was the lingua franca. Yeah.
Same thing with writing a gospel in Hebrew. One of the problems with that is it's never going to be a bestseller, right? You've limited your audience. Papyrus was not easily obtained either. Writing, 25,000 words or what have you, it's a task, and it's expensive in those days. It's really a lot of, so you would want to put some, if you're going to go to all that effort and all that time, you're going to want to put something down that's going to reach a broad audience and be understood much more broadly. I mean, I can imagine that there are fingerprints of Hebrew throughout the Gospels because they're Hebrew writers and they're living in the Hebrew age, and we do the same thing. We get Americanisms, that we don't even have conscious knowledge that we're doing when we're putting stuff together. But that's just because, it comes from our cultural milieu.
Well, Wes, would Hebrew, like official Hebrew, would that have been fairly exclusive at the time? I mean, would that have been more reserved for the upper class or just the religious class?
It was like Latin was in the last century. It was a formal language, but everybody spoke Aramaic, colloquially, or Greek.
Okay. Yeah. So this is a debated issue, but I think the consensus is, and I would agree with it, that Hebrew was largely relegated to an ecclesiastical language within the Jewish community, that it certainly wasn't unknown in the way that Latin became in the Middle Ages. It would have been used pretty frequently, and you would have gone to the synagogues and heard Hebrew spoken and even taught in Hebrew.
Or read in Hebrew, right.
Yeah, pretty frequently. But this was such a multi-linguistic age that you would have been speaking, ever since the Babylonian exile, you would have been speaking Aramaic, but Greek had become so prolific and actually had incorporated into the Jewish language so much that, in the aftermath of the Maccabean revolt, you have Jewish and Greek names being used, right? So you have...
right. Everybody's got their Jewish name, and then they got, Saul, Paul, and everybody's got a Greek or Latin name as well.
Yeah, and although it's often claimed that the 10 disciples held Hebrew Aramaic names, that's not entirely true. Hebrew names can end in any letter, but Greek words and names can really only end in the vowel sounds N, S, or R. So if you look at the given names, say in Matthew chapter 10, verses 2-4, where you have the disciples listed, apart from the two Simons, all the rest of the names end with the Greek S. So that doesn't necessarily mean that names like Thomas, Bartimaeus, or James, Jacobos, right, are Greek, but it does mean they are presented in nativized, or that they're at least nativized with Greek terminations. So it was not uncommon to adopt the Hebrew Old Testament names like Jacob and then Greekize them into Jacobos, which is exactly what we see. Or Miriam, Hebrew, Maria, Greek. We see these kind of used back and forth within. And we even have examples of like Bar, which is Aramaic for son of, with Timaeus, which is the name of one of Plato's characters. So Bartimaeus is a combination Aramaic Greek name. So that's how prolific these things were.
Yeah, that's good. That's probably good to point out because, I mean, that would be relevant to this idea that, when they're writing, the gospel writers are writing in Greek, and they may not be translating Jesus's words. They may just, they're just recording what Jesus said in Greek. That's a good point.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think we have to be careful there.
Yeah.
But I think,
right.
I think in some places, Jesus might even be paraphrased. And I think that that's also appropriate too. But in other places, particularly like the Beatitudes, I think we have a verbatim collection of Jesus's teaching.
Right. That's good. I'm just saying, just so now we're thinking Jesus exclusively spoke in Aramaic so that everything the gospel writers wrote that are out of the mouth of Jesus had to be some kind of translation that, there might be very well be times and places, maybe even, I mean, that's an interesting study. I'm assuming people have done that study. Like, where might we think Jesus would have just spoken directly to his audience in Greek instead of maybe Aramaic? Wes, this has been really good, very helpful. Before we sign off, where can people who watch this video find your ministry and your writings and some of your other work?
The one-stop shop would be wesleyhuff.com, WESLEYHUFF. And you can also find me on apologeticscanada.com, which is the organization I work with. And otherwise, all of my social media links and kind of YouTube platform, that can all be found at wesleyhuff.com. So I'll just leave that as the one-stop shop, and then people can branch out from there.
Okay, great. And we'll put links into all that good content as well. Well, thank you again, my friend. It's been good sort of seeing you. And we'll have to do this again sometime.
It's fun. Thank you for having me.
All right. Thanks, brother.